Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
If you're listening to this podcast, then you're in great company. We've got thousands of listeners who have a thirst for continuous improvement and raising standards in business. Whether your interest is in quality, sustainability, or risk standards, I'd love to welcome you as a member to our online platform for all things ISO, the ISology Hub. The ISology Hub is the leading place to get access to all of your online resources, from in-depth training courses through to our very popular coffee break training, to templates and action plans and many other resources to help raise standards. As a member, you get access to over 100 courses, taking you from learner to practitioner to leader. The ISology Hub has all the resources that you need, which will really help to make your life easier and to help improve compliance in those business critical areas. So if you'd like access to learning and compliance resources ranging from data privacy to environmental management, anti-bribery, business continuity, quality, health and safety, to name just but a few, the list is endless actually, then we'd love you to come and join us. Just head over to the isologyhub.com. Hello and welcome to the ISO Show. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Jack Morris, Account Director at Epiq, for the second part in our series all about cyber incident management. Welcome back, Jack.
Thank you for having me again. I'm glad you brought me back on.
Yeah, well, we covered so much ground in the last episode about how to prepare for any potential cyber incident and how to mitigate risk. And this is one that I know that a lot of our listeners will be tuning into, which is about what do they need to do should, unfortunately, a cyber incident actually affect their organisation. So I know that there's a lot of ground to cover here, and very excited about talking to you about that today. But before we dive into that, just to provide some context for our listeners that didn't join the last episode, just to give you a bit of an overview. I mean, Epiq is a global leader in technology-enabled legal services. In fact, it supports 90% of the top law firms globally. So it has true international reach. It has of 8,000 employees spread across 19 countries. And it also has an 800 bit site score, which is phenomenal, which is, helps to demonstrate its credibility and trust in this space, particularly in relation to the topic that we're talking about today. But ultimately, Epiq supports corporations, law firms, and government agencies. Although at a global level, they also have local insights and execution as well in terms of how they can deliver their services. And they support large organisations with long-lasting relationships, but they also support small and medium organisations as well, to support them with things like forensic data collection, all aspects of litigation actually in terms of analytics and document review and analysis. They also cover regulatory compliance, legal operations, helping to select technology and optimization of technology, commercial and contracting, and mergers and acquisitions, amongst many others as well. So, absolutely delighted and very honoured to have Jack back with us today to talk about how to deal with a cyber incident, how to basically respond effectively in the event of a cyber incident. So, Jack, let's dive straight in. What would you say constitutes a cyber incident, and why would you say it's so important to respond effectively?
Thanks, Mel. So a cyber incident in itself essentially refers to any unauthorized access or attempted access to an organization's IT system. So incidents in itself can range very broadly across data breaches, malware infections, business email compromises, as well as insider threats. Responding effectively to a cyber incident is crucial to minimize damage and protect sensitive data. There are numerous knock-on effects that can occur should an organization not respond effectively, but I think it's very, very important that we flip that in terms of looking at what organizations can do to make sure that they're responding effectively if there is an incident that does occur.
Mm. And I think, cyber incidents affect pretty much all organisations. So if we haven't been affected, as our own organisation, we definitely know another organisation that has. And we know that there are increasing risks in this area. And what would you say is the cyber incident landscape at the moment? I mean, what does that look like? And what challenges are organisations facing in responding to an incident?
It's a really great question, Mel. The cyber incident landscape itself is ever evolving, it's ever changing, right? I think that it's a traditional cat and mouse type activity where people like us, Epiq, other cyber vendors, organizations themselves, law firms are consistently and continually having to play catch up to these cyber threat actors who are using increasingly comprehensive technology to be able to access these organizations' data. So it's really, really important that we make sure that we are staying at the forefront of both knowledge as well as technology. In general, as a sort of a wide landscape, attacks are on the rise. The number of organizations that were posted on ransomware and data theft sites increased over 70% year on year last year. So again, it's really, really important that we make sure that everyone is aware that the number of attacks are increasing, but we need to make sure that when they do occur, because as you mentioned on the last pod, Mel, it is very much a situation of when and how many times is my organization going to be impacted by a cyber incident? Whereas a couple of years ago, it used to be, oh gosh, we hope that we don't get impacted by a cyber incident. It's about responding effectively when one does occur. In general, the most sort of common cyber incident that does occur is a business email compromise. Or BC. In 2023, they increased by 67%, which again is an exponential amount of growth in business email compromises. These BECs can occur from essentially people like myself receiving a malicious phishing email and clicking on that link and essentially allowing the threat actors to get access to my mailbox. Looking back to your question where you spoke about the challenges that organizations are facing when responding to cyber incidents, I think there are three main challenges that organizations face today when responding to a cyber incident. The first being the day-to-day management of an incident. Of course, we mentioned the fact that it's more a matter of time and how many times you're going to be impacted by a cyber incident. But typically, organizations haven't had to respond to many cyber incidents before the first time they get impacted. So again, it's being able to balance the technical aspects of a cyber incident with the broader business continuity, the communications, potential financial and legality complications that can occur from a cyber incident. And it's hugely difficult for a business to be able to juggle all of these plates whilst being able to actually deal with a cyber incident. So again, I think that the main challenge that organizations are facing today is about actually managing an incident when it does occur.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the second point is around expertise and support. I think that navigating an increasingly complex legal, technical, and operational aspects of a cyber incident is becoming increasingly important and difficult to do. So I think it's really, really important that organizations are looking for external support in terms of just from a knowledge perspective, but also having sound relationships and having those organizations that that you can call on 12 o'clock in the evening on a Friday night when you get impacted by a cyber incident, because they typically occur on a Friday night. It's about trying to find out exactly who you can trust and who you can engage with, right?
Yeah.
The final of the three challenges that we typically see is around the data-focused impact. It's really difficult for organizations in themselves to actually understand what data we hold as a business. But then being able to understand and assess the risk of that data during an incident is obviously really, really difficult to do as well. So again, I think it's about understanding the challenges they have is about understanding what data they house and ultimately what risks are associated to that when an incident does occur.
Okay, great. So just to recap, so the main challenges that you see organisations facing when responding to a cyber incident is the day-to-day management. So is that balance of the technical aspects, etc., with business continuity. The second one was expertise and support, so navigating all the complexities of, from an operational technical perspective, and then looking at the data as far as, okay, so in terms of criticality to the business, understanding and assessing the risk associated with that. So I mean, what would you say if they're kind of the top challenges that you see that organisations are facing? What would you say are the solutions then to these challenges?
Yeah, I think that thankfully for the listeners, and try not to scaremonger and look at it as too doom and gloom, I think that online now, because cyber in itself is such a sort of hot topic across numerous industries, the amount of free to access information and expertise out there is staggering. I think that it's really, really useful for organizations and people within an organization to do their research, right? To get more of an understanding as to what cyber is, what are the risks, and how can I be I might only feel like a very small cog in a very bigger organization, but what can I do to make sure that I'm as cyber secure as possible, and how can I help an organization in responding to a cyber incident? So the free to receive information is great. The potential difficulty with utilizing that only is that typically this information is very generalized. I think that I spoke to it in the first episode that we recorded. Cyber is very much not a one size fits all. Each incident that occurs is different in terms of what's being accessed, how they got in, and what they've been doing. So it's really, really important that organizations have that support structure externally to make sure that they have relationships with either law firms, perhaps cyber incident response experts, whether that be from an incident response retainer perspective or having an information governance consultant that they're engaged with, just having that external support. And then the sort of underlying pillar around this in terms of being able to respond effectively to a cyber incident is having a cyber insurance policy on board, because it will support you with both the day-to-day management of an incident as well as the actual commercial impact of an incident as well. So I think that having those external relationships with law firms, with consultants, and with cyber insurers is how organizations can be able to overcome those challenges.
I mean, in reality, obviously organisations should be responding effectively to a cyber incident, but it may be that, some organisations might just bury their head in the sand and hope it goes away and not deal with it very effectively. What would you say the consequences for an organisation that aren't prepared to respond effectively to a cyber incident?
Yeah, I think that you're completely right. I think that it's human nature to try and look for the easy route in certain situations. Unfortunately, you can't ignore a cyber incident. You need to be able to respond to it effectively. There are numerous issues that can arise from not being able to respond effectively to a cyber incident, and they do have some severe complications for a business. If we look at it from an operational standpoint, if there's a prolonged exposure to sensitive data, or if ransomware is infected in systems and it's expanding within a business, the organization will not have access to potentially crucial business information. So financial losses, higher costs to incident response, and etc. can come from poor planning. So the operational aspect is really, really key, especially for small to medium businesses. Having a day or two out of being able to actually function and get some revenue is potentially really detrimental. We saw in a previous stat that 60% of businesses that have been impacted by a cyber incident go out of business within the 6 months following. That's because of the operational issues, and we'll talk about some financial losses in the next sort of portion here.
And sorry, Jeff, I was just going to say that, looking at what Epiq does and the sectors, that obviously you've got a huge presence in predominantly the legal sector. You can see how important this is, to that sector, because obviously not only are they basically handling very sensitive data, but there's their own commercial data, but also client commercially sensitive data. But also, I think it's about, looking at accessibility as well. So if they haven't got access to that, then, they can very quickly calculate the loss to the business, because obviously they're charging out by the hour or even by the minute, I guess, in some cases. So it's very easy for them to be able to calculate that risk and loss. But it's not just that, it goes beyond that, doesn't it, in terms of reputational damage and loss of trust and confidence in the supply chain.
Yeah, it does indeed. When I was working over in the data management side of a business that I was at prior to joining Epiq, we dealt with data recovery. So whether that was a hard drive that was broken or an SSD drive that was corrupted, but a lot of the work that we did, and we were seeing an increasing amount towards the end of my time there, was around ransomware. I remember one case specifically, we were engaged with a photographer. He was a one-man band. He had a couple of SSD cards and he was infected by ransomware. And that was catastrophic for his business, because he had taken numerous pictures and videos of weddings and simply couldn't deliver on what he'd promised to his clients. So again, it goes back to that knock-on effect. And segueing in nicely to the next challenge there is around if you don't effectively respond to a cyber incident, the damage to reputation and the trust of your business can essentially run your business out of operation, because it's really, really important that you make sure that your customers, partners, stakeholders within a business have long-term relationships with you. They trust in what you're doing and they make sure that their data is going to be sufficiently housed. So again, not being able to respond to an incident is catastrophic for a business. Additional things that can come up if you don't respond effectively to a cyber incident is additional data breaches. If an organization doesn't respond effectively to a cyber incident, being able to take steps to gain control over their systems, additional data breaches can occur from threat actors gaining further access into an organization's system. So again, it can be one situation. If you were to put your head in the sand, if an incident does occur, you know that other impacted systems within your business can occur. So it's really, really important to make sure that you're responding effectively. And I think that goes back to the last episode we recorded where we were talking about proactive software solutions that organizations can take on. We spoke about managed detection and response solutions, which essentially proactively manage and monitor your cyber infrastructure to make sure that if an incident is occurring, you get alerted early. So again, this goes down to that point of being able to shut the door effectively, making sure that there's no additional data breaches that occur.
So how can organisations do that, Jack, then? How can they pick up on that in terms of detection? I know we did touch on software briefly in the previous episode, but what are your recommendations there?
Yeah, I think that cyber incidents in themselves can vary in terms of what's detectable, i.e. how a user like myself would be able to understand that we are subject to a cyber incident. Organizations and end users could typically experience either slow systems, being locked out of accounts, maybe not being able to access my email mailbox, not being able to send emails, not being able to receive, having the inability to access documents or share drives. The telltale sign of ransomware is receiving a ransomware demand. It would say, we've got your server impacted here, ransomware X has infected your systems, pay us 10 Bitcoin to be able to get access to your systems again. So that's a real telltale sign you've been impacted there. I think that, again, we mentioned the managed detection and response piece. They are going to be the most sort of foolproof way of detecting whether there's a cyber incident, because it will provide you logs of what's happening and being able to provide that information to you. But all of these things are sort of telltale signs that your organization is being impacted by a cyber incident.
Okay, so let's say, following on from this recording of the podcast, I've been affected. There's been a cyber incident at my business. What do I do next? Could you just walk me through step by step what I should do?
Sure. Yeah, it's another really, really great question. And again, it goes back to our first episode. So I urge the listeners, if you haven't already listened to the first episode, please do so, because within that session, we were talking about what organizations can do to be proactive in mitigating their risk. And the number one theme there was about implementing readiness response plans. So having a readiness response plan is super, super important, because an organization will then have detailed understanding of what they should be doing in the event of a cyber incident. But to sort of generalize it for the purposes of this session, the initial piece is about assessing the severity and impact of an incident. So being able to instruct a first response organization to go in there, to be able to shut the doors, to be able to assess the damage, to understand, okay, well, these systems have been impacted. This is how they got in between what frailty, and this is what we need to do to close the door. So it goes back to organizations having potential incident response retainers to make sure that they're able to access that business as soon as possible, to make sure that there isn't going to be any potential additional data breaches. So that initial piece is that triage, right? To understand how they got in, when they got in, and what they got to is super, super important. The next stage in terms of being able to actually respond to a cyber incident is identification. So to understand what's happening to my business post-incident. So again, things like locked out of business accounts, not being able to access my shared drive, not being able to access business systems. We need to understand exactly what's happening to my business after this incident. Maybe my accounts person that's been working for me has had their mailbox impacted and they're sending out emails to their suppliers asking for payments, for example. What's happening to my business, and ultimately what do we need to do to be able to resolve that? Which is the next portion to the incident response portion, is how can we resolve the cyber incident? So taking technical actions to be able to mitigate the incident. So maybe shutting off access to certain accounts, being able to essentially close that door to make sure that there isn't going to be any knock-on issues that arise from that cyber incident. The fourth portion is probably one of the most important. Of course, it's all super, super important, but one of the really, really important points from a law firm and from a legal perspective is being able to report on these cyber incidents. So being able to notify relevant stakeholders internally, externally, being able to report on that and notify impacted entities of saying, okay, Jack Morris, your bank account details have been impacted as part of this cyber incident. This is who you should be calling if you have any questions on that. This is super, super important to be able to report both to the regulatory bodies within that 72-hour period of understanding that personal data has been impacted, but also to be able to make sure that, again, it goes back to that point we were talking about trust, to make sure that you're transparent about a situation. Say, okay, look, this is what's happened, this is what's been impacted, and these are the steps that we've taken retrospectively to make sure that your data is as safe as possible. The last portion is something that people should do in any walk of life, is to learn from what's happened, i.e. understand the incident. What frailties do we have? What potential issues, what challenges have we had? And what can we do to prevent the same incident happening again? I think that we spoke about it earlier. We said about 61% of organisations that have been impacted by a cyber incident are then impacted within the next 12 months. It's super, super important that we make sure that we are shutting the doors, we're learning from our mistakes, we're making sure that we are more cyber secure for the next time that they come knocking at the door.
Are you new to ISO standards and want to know what it's all about? Or maybe your company has multiple ISO standards, but there's a lack of engagement and compliance. Whether it's quality, sustainability, or risk standards, the Isology Hub is your one-stop shop for all your online learning resources associated with raising your company's standards. From as little as £99 a month, you can have unlimited access to hundreds of online training courses and achieve certification for completion of courses along the way, which will take you from learner to practitioner to leader in no time. So what courses are in the Hub? Well, there are courses on everything a head of quality, sustainability, information security and health and safety would need to manage compliance and raise standards. With over 100 courses available to you, here are examples of just a few. ISO 9001 Internal Auditor, how to transition to the new ISO 27001 standard, the role of ESG in quality management, and how to integrate management systems. But it's not just courses in the Isology Hub. You can access templates, downloads, and action checklists to take your business to the next level. So why not try the Isology Hub today? Just click on the link at www.isologyhub.com and you'll get access to all our resources within minutes. If you're interested in embedding best practice across your organisation or would like to develop an awareness and training programme for employees, we offer a free learning and development session to tailor a bespoke training programme based on your organisation's needs. So we'd love for you to join as an Isology Hub member. Just head over to isologyhub.com to get access to your unlimited training and compliance resources. You mentioned earlier on about reporting, and notifying relevant stakeholders, because obviously as soon as you've dealt with that situation, you're going to be communicating, to your clients, of course, as soon as possible, and employees and other stakeholders. At what stage should you be contacting your insurance company if you have got cyber security insurance in place? And does this process help in terms of, making a claim if you've got all of the evidence to kind of back up the incident?
Yeah, cyber insurance provides a pivotal role when it comes to incident response. Just like with any walk of life, insurance is crucial in making sure that we're able to respond effectively to disasters, whether that's car insurance, maybe I've got into a car accident, maybe house insurance, the house is burned down, making sure that we have the ability and the expertise, both commercially and as well as having that sort of actual expertise and understanding to be able to respond to an incident. So there are three things that cyber insurance provides to a cyber incident response. And that's the first is response funding. So the insurer covers the costs related to the incident response, including professional services. We spoke about the incident response triage, engaging with incident response organisations. The cyber insurance coverage will cover you to be able to pay for that. The second portion is around response time. So these insurers are dealing with cyber claims on a daily basis, right? Whereas an organization isn't dealing with a cyber incident on a daily basis. So these insurance organizations are able to bring in experts promptly to be able to improve the incident resolution, right? We mentioned earlier that the incident response organizations have relationships with both cyber vendors like Epiq and other law firms as well. So they'll already have a provided panel of organizations that are A, trusted, B, know the processes, and C, can make sure that they are insurer approved. So engaging with a cyber insurer as soon as you are aware of a cyber incident is crucially important, because it will support them in giving you access to best-in-class people and technology.
Yeah, I mean, it's been our experience at Blackmores, having implemented risk-based management systems for organisations, whether that's health and safety or information security or business continuity, there have been a reduction in insurance costs as a result of that. And that's because, number one, they've got the controls in place, so they've got the procedures, and they've got the documentation in order to be able to capture the records, whether that's in, software or, whatever that may be. But it basically means that they can actively demonstrate how they're mitigating risk, to basically say, well, I've basically done everything that was reasonably possible, in this scenario. Would you say that it's going to be advantageous for organisations to look at cyber security controls, risk mitigation from the point of view of helping to reduce their overall insurance costs?
Absolutely. Epiq as an organisation have significant number of relationships across numerous geographies in terms of the insurance vertical. And something that we're seeing consistently cropping up nowadays is that cyber insurers are having more stringent requirements for organisations to A, get approved for cyber insurance, but also to be able to lower their premiums and make sure that the coverage is higher. So again, doing all these things that we spoke about in the first episode, where we spoke about being proactive in implementing response plans, having organisational relationships with law firms, with cybersecurity professionals, all of these types of things can allow an organisation to go back to an insurer and say, look, we are doing all of these things proactively. We are doing everything that we can to mitigate our risk. We just want cyber insurance coverage to make sure that we can pay for situations should they occur. But ultimately, we're doing everything we can to make sure that that doesn't happen. But candidly, these things are definitely a situation of when rather than if, unfortunately.
Mm. And if there is a cyber incident, I think that could have a knock-on effect for GDPR compliance here in the UK. Now, I know obviously we have a global organisation. We have listeners across the globe that tune into the ISO show, because obviously we deal with international standards. Which kind of obligations are you aware of, Jack? And if our listeners are in the UK, what would you say to them in terms of what are their kind of responsibilities after an incident?
Sure. Yeah, the legal obligations of a cyber incident are very clear. An organisation simply has to report any personal data breaches within 72 hours of awareness, unless the risk to individuals' rights is unlikely. So again, this is super important to make sure that, okay, as an organisation, I've understood that Mel Blackmore's mobile phone number, Mel Blackmore's passport details have been compromised as part of a cyber incident. I need to alert her to that fact to make sure that I'm adhering to the regulatory requirements there. So again, it's really, really important that an organisation has a relationship with a law firm, because those law firms are going to have practice groups that have been able to support with those obligations. So it's super, super important that an organisation is proactive in understanding what their legal obligations are ahead of time. But yeah, that 72 hours is a really, really short time frame. So making sure that you have everything lined up and ready to go is super, super important.
And what support's out there at the moment then, Jack, for organisations that sadly may be a victim to a cyber incident?
Yeah, but we spoke about, I think that the amount of information out there is staggering right now, which is really, really great. I also think when it comes to having vendors like Epiq or law firms or cyber insurers that are ready to actually provide information to you, there is an exceptional amount of information out there, right? So I think that it's really, really important that having that coverage, having those relationships are something that we can provide to you. Having a relationship with an organisation like Epiq, for example, we're talking every day to organisations about what they can do to be proactive in mitigating risk, but more frequently we're having conversations with organisations around actually managing an incident. They're coming to us and saying, look, my cyber insurance partner has told me to come in and speak to you. You're an incident response organisation. You know what to do in terms of dealing with it. How can I help? I think that it's one of those things where it's super important for these organizations to have those relationships, to understand who they're talking to. But the amount of support out there is staggering. It's simple. There is a lot of information that you can see online for free. So I think that it's just that taking that step of being proactive in taking that information in is the first step.
Mm. So moving on from that, obviously that's free advice, but obviously there are professionals out there to help organisations to deal with an incident, including, for example, law firms or your own internal legal team, and also vendors like Epiq, which obviously we can come on to in a moment. So let's start with a legal team. So that could be an internal legal team if a company is fortunate enough to have that, or they may have a particular law firm on a retainer just in case there is an incident. What's the main role in terms of the part that they play in helping to deal with an incident?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Mel. The legal teams play a very critical role in responding to an incident. They will provide the regulatory and also the legal advice that's required to deal effectively with a cyber incident. So the first portion there is around the breach notification. So the legal support ensures that an organization is compliant when it comes to data breach disclosure laws, as well as regulatory compliance. We spoke around those tight deadlines for organizations to make those aware for personal data breaches. But having that law firm either on retainer, like you mentioned, or having that support internally is crucial to understand what your obligations are from a legal perspective. Something that we're seeing increasingly now when it comes to cyber practice groups within law firms is they're acting as breach counsel. So the law firm acts as breach counsel for the organisation to enable them to support and advise on the legal implications of a cyber incident. So most law firm practice groups now have relationships with external vendors like Epiq to be able to support in the operational response, but it's super important that they coordinate those external vendors to make sure that there's compliance on that aspect. So again, if you think of this in terms of two sort of separate thought tracks, you're talking around the legal obligations of a cyber incident and you're talking around the operational aspect. The law firm acting as a breach counsel can support with the legal aspect, and they can also bring in vendors like Epiq to be able to support with the operational piece. The third value that legal team adds to a cyber incident response is around privacy law compliance. So they guide handling of personal data and privacy implications to ensure that there are no further follow-on action or issues that arise from a cyber incident. So again, a consistent theme here is that it's really keen to make sure that you understand what your legal obligations are and you make sure that you're compliant with them.
Okay, great. Thank you. You obviously mentioned about Epic, and this is where obviously, the font of all knowledge when it comes to supporting organisations with that whole incident response life cycle, really. But could you just expand on that, please, Jack, in terms of the role that Epic could play in relation to that incident response life cycle?
Absolutely. So just as we mentioned with law firms providing the legal advice and being able to support in responding to a cyber incident response organisations like Epiq support with the operational aspect. So initially, vendors like Epiq will support in the incident identification as well as forensic investigation. So we spoke earlier about essentially finding the open door, closing it, and learning from that. After we've identified the impacted systems, the next portion here is to talk around investigating how the threat actor got access to the to your business systems, and it prevents you from sort of opening further doors. Following that, the operational partner will be able to support in the understanding of the extent of the incident. So essentially understanding who the impacted entities are, being able to notify them of the incident and being able to provide remediation, such as supporting with follow-on litigation or mass claims that come from it. But essentially, you can think of an organisation like Epiq as your operational standpoint, your IT support. Okay, we need to understand what's been impacted, ultimately who's been impacted, whether that comes from personal data, and then we need to notify these people to make sure that they're aware of their incident having impacted their data. So it's super important that organizations are engaged with both legal teams but also the operational response to make sure that they can actually respond effectively to a cyber incident.
So if our listeners would like to discuss this with you in further detail, what we'll do is we'll leave your contact details in the show notes. So if anybody would like to reach out and speak to Jack about that in a bit more detail, obviously we're literally just skimming the surface there in terms of the role that Epic could play in supporting you both, proactively managing risk, but also how to handle incidents in the event of a cyber incident. So talking about the cyber incidents then in terms of the next step as well, we talked about insurance briefly earlier on. I know that, when we renewed our company insurance, that cyber insurance was part and parcel of that. So, I mean, is it mandatory now or is it still optional?
I think that now it's becoming more of a requirement for organizations to have cyber insurance rather than a sort of nice to have. The cost of responding to a cyber incident is increasing as the number of systems, the amount of data that we hold in those organizations is increasing too, right? So I think that in some circumstances, when we're talking about small to medium businesses anyway, having cyber insurance is candidly the only way that they're going to be able to respond effectively to a cyber incident, right? Having access to best in class technology, best in class people, it comes with a cost. So you need to make sure that you have efficient commercial support there. And ultimately, that's where insurance plays a pivotal part, right? So I think it's becoming increasingly important. I would urge most organizations, if not all of them, to have cyber insurance of some form, and then to take those preventative steps we spoke about earlier in the previous episode.
Okay, great. And I know that obviously we touched on in the previous episode about proactively looking at risk mitigation when it came to cyber incidents. But what would you say then organisations should do in future to prevent any further incidents?
Yeah, I think that it's super important. If we're talking about this from a proactive piece, I think that the prevention and the preparedness are the two key factors when it comes to effective response. I think that Benjamin Franklin's quote is so true here when it says, "By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail." It's as simple as that. Making sure that you have appropriate relationships externally, making sure you've got response readiness plans, making sure you're taking software solutions out that are being able to be proactive in mitigating your impact. I think all of those things are super, super important. I urge the listeners again, if they haven't listened to the first episode, to do so as we go into a lot more depth on what those preventive and proactive steps can be. But I think the underlying theme here and the takeaway for the listeners is that you need to be proactive and you need to be prepared, because if you haven't already had a knock at the door from a cyber threat actor, this one is coming. So you need to make sure that you have the processes in place to be able to effectively respond to an incident when they do occur.
Yeah, and I think lessons learned is so invaluable as well, isn't it? If you do have an incident, I know obviously first reaction is to respond to it and to mitigate risk, the immediate risk initially. But I think if we're going back to ISO standards, for example, they're all based on continual improvement. This plan, do, check, act cycle, and I think it's imperative that organisations, if they do unfortunately have an incident, that they do learn from that, that there are records of that, and then they can look back and say, okay, what would we do differently? Could we do to improve this situation? Should we have another cybersecurity incident? And that's linked into continuing improvement clause 10 on the majority of the ISO management systems. Not just ISO 27001, which obviously has procedures in there for incident response, but many other standards as well. So just finally then, what would you say your top 3 tips for our listeners? And I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit. Your top 3 tips for our listeners to take away from this really informative podcast today to help them to respond effectively to an incident.
Yeah, definitely putting me on the spot there, Mel. Thanks for that. But no, joking aside, I think that I'm verging on sounding like a broken record here, but I think that the first thing that organizations can take away and they can implement today is an incident response plan. So we spoke through incident response plans during the first episode, but essentially creating a plan that outlines the roles, the responsibilities, and the communication channels within an organization, both internally and externally during an incident, is key. So having an implemented response plan, being able to regularly test that plan and simulate the incidents is really, really key to ensuring an effective response. Making sure that a plan is great, but making sure that you're testing against that plan to make sure that it is robust enough and actually appropriate to the real world. It's really easy to talk about scenarios that aren't real, but being able to actually test that against potential real life examples is super, super important. So undergoing forensic tabletop exercises or sort of stress testing of your incident response plan is super, super important. Number 2, I would say that organizations should be engaging external experts as early as possible. So we spoke in the first episode about organizations establishing relationships with both law firms, organizations like Epiq, and also cyber insurance organizations. having those relationships ready to go and engaging with them early during an incident is critical. So having the legal advice from the law firm, having the operational advice and the support from a vendor like Epiq, and having the expertise and the financial support from an insurance organisation is of course how you're going to be able to respond effectively. So as soon as an incident does occur, if you've not got an incident response retainer, being able to engage with your law firm, with your providers that you're engaged with as early as possible to make sure that they're shutting the doors, preventing further issues, and making sure that you're responding within your required timeframes. So I say that's the second point. Number 3, and this is for obviously for all types of businesses, but also very, very, very important for small to medium businesses, prioritize your business continuity. So enable the external experts that we spoke about in the last point to support you through the incident, allowing you to free up bandwidth to ensure that you minimize damage and downtime to your business. We spoke earlier, over 60% of organizations that are hit by a cyber incident go out of business within the next 6 months following the incident. It's super, super important. I appreciate for small to medium businesses where perhaps you're a trailblazer within your organization, you're wearing a lot of hats. I can appreciate that it's a very precious thing for you and you want to keep control over as much as you can. But candidly, these law firms, these organizations like Epiq and these insurance carriers are dealing with cyber claims on a daily basis. So you need to make sure that you're trusting them to do what they do best, whilst you can focus on your business and making sure that you're not losing out on business returns. So yeah, being able to prioritize your business continuity would be my third point.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Jack. You've provided some brilliant insights, guidance, tips on all things cybersecurity in terms of incidents, and exactly what we need to do in terms of next steps. So I'm sure that some of our listeners will be going back and listening to this again and making notes if they're currently listening to this commuting or doing something where they're not at their desk. So yeah, that's been really invaluable. And I think although we have thousands of listeners, to the ISO show, even if we just have one person that's listening that takes action as a result of listening to this, it will be definitely worthwhile. So yeah, please do take heed of that advice. This is based on experience, vast experience of dealing with many organisations that have dealt with security and in particular cyber incidents as well. So yeah, Epiq do know exactly what they're talking about here. So it's well worth taking note of all of the advice and guidance that Jack's provided us today. But as I said earlier, if you'd like to reach out to Jack, then his contact details are going to be on the podcast show notes, which will be available via the link on whichever media player you're listening to this today. But yeah, I'd just like to say on behalf of all of our listeners at the ISO show, thanks very much for joining us today, Jack.
No, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And yeah, further details on Epiq, of course, will be provided in links in the show notes as well. So thanks very much for joining us today, and I look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of the ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.